Did the New Testament authors ever reference the Apocrypha? What books did they consider canon? After all, they do quite a bit of quoting and alluding to ancient scriptures. There are some scholars, both secular and Protestant, who argue that the New Testament shows no evidence that the authors believed that any of the Deuterocanon was scripture. Then, other scholars say that the New Testament literally has dozens of references to the Deuterocanon. When I dug into the evidence, I found that both sides of this argument often make critical mistakes in the way that they interpret and present the evidence. Like humans do. One argument from silence you often hear is that the New Testament never quotes the Deuterocanon. By the end of this lesson, we'll actually find one such quote, but here I just want to point out that direct quotes are not the only way to reference a work. So let's dive in. Firstly, I'll consider the evidence presented by many scholars I've read who argue that the New Testament is just full of allusions to the Deuterocanon. What I found is that many, but not all, of the allusions they reference are actually already found in the Hebrew Bible. For instance, Romans 9:21 compares God to a potter who can mold or remold his creation like clay however he wants. This is sometimes cited as evidence that the author was relying on Wisdom 15:7. One of the problems with this is that Wisdom 15:7 is speaking out against idolatry, not drawing a metaphor about how God can do whatever he likes with his creation. But maybe the biggest problem with the assertion that Paul is referencing wisdom is that the metaphor of God as a potter is already found multiple times in Isaiah and Jeremiah 18, both of which were written long before wisdom. Although the author of Wisdom does use similar wording about vessels being used for clean and unclean use like Paul, I would argue that that is not a smoking gun of a New Testament author citing the Deuterocanon as scripture. By the way, here's a quick, interesting side note about Wisdom. Recall from a previous lesson that it was one of the most cited deuterocanonical works by the earliest Christian patristic writers. One of the possible reasons for this is that it does such a good job of paralleling some of the most popular scriptures of the Hebrew Bible, like Isaiah and Proverbs. Also, I find it to be among the most well-written of the deuterocanonical books, and if I may venture to have an opinion as someone who is not particularly wise, I find its wisdom to be wiser than other works of the Deuterocanon, such as Sirach. Let's now return to another example often given by those who argue that the New Testament authors cite the Deuterocanon. Romans 11:34 asks, "Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor?" This sounds an awful lot like Wisdom 9:13 that says, "For who can learn the counsel of God, or who can discern what the Lord wills?" However, once again, Wisdom is echoing Isaiah, this time from Isaiah 40:13 and 14, which says, "Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has instructed him?" Likewise, Matthew 9:36 speaks of the people being like sheep without a shepherd, like in Judith 11:19. But such an expression in the context of speaking of God's people is even found in the Torah itself in Numbers 27:17, and as well in 2 Chronicles 18:16. There are several more examples like this that I've seen scholars cite, but I only want to mention one more, which is quite an interesting case in its own right. All three synoptic gospels mention a confrontation Jesus has with the Sadducees in Matthew 22, Mark 12, and Luke 20, in which they tell him of a woman who had been married to 7 husbands who had all died in succession, which seems like a very uncommon story, but such an account is actually found in the book of Tobit. This is interesting because our historical sources seem to suggest that the Sadducees primarily followed the Torah, as I mentioned already. This begs the question of whether they consider Tobit as an actual historical account, regardless of whether they viewed it as scripture. However, this is not a case of the gospel writer citing the work as authoritative at all, even though one scholar I found strongly stated that the gospel writers are speaking to the canonicity of Tobit. So we've seen examples which are hardly conclusive proof that the New Testament writers relied on deuterocanonical books. Now I'd like to cite what I believe are the best evidence that they actually did at least allude to or adapt such books. Now, an allusion to another writing does not necessarily prove that the author thought the work he referenced was scripture. Paul, for instance, quotes a pagan philosopher for illustrative purposes, not as scripture. You can be the judge of whether the allusions that follow were referencing the Deuterocanon as scripture. Hebrews 11 is the famous Hall of Faith passage. One would hardly argue that it was not citing these great examples of faith as scripture. The chapter cites many specific heroes and mighty works of God found throughout the scriptures. Then at verse 32, It says that time would fail us to go over all these great examples of faith, and fires off multiple names in quick succession without elaborating, names whose stories are familiar to us from the Hebrew Bible. Then it lists multiple kinds of more general hardships that God's people had endured, yet still maintained their faith. Interestingly, some of these details sound less like the Hebrew Bible than the Deuterocanon. For instance, it mentions tortures. You might think of Jeremiah or Joseph being thrown into a pit, but not really torture per se in the Hebrew Bible. The Deuterocanon, on the other hand, has some accounts of this, particularly 2 Maccabees 7, which speaks not only graphically of torture, but also of a mother who watches her sons be tortured to death, but encourages them not to renounce God's law. Plus, this passage speaks of the resurrection and this woman receiving her dead. All details found in Hebrews 11:35. No, Hebrews does not give us enough detail to know for sure if it is speaking of this specific account in 2 Maccabees, but it certainly sounds like it, and there's none like it in the Hebrew Bible. We'll come back to Hebrews in a moment. Let's now turn to the teachings of Jesus. You might think that Jesus' teachings were original with him, since he had such a strong influence on mankind, all without having written a single book. But often he would borrow from Scripture. In fact, I think it's interesting that some of his teachings actually come from Proverbs, and of course he relies heavily on the Torah as well as other prophets, such as Isaiah. So did he ever say anything that sounds a lot like a deuterocanonical book? Jesus is often credited with the golden rule found in Luke 6:31, but a remarkably similar command is found in Tobit 4:15, often called the negative golden rule or the silver rule. It says, never do to others what you don't want them to do to you. But you could argue that this is nowhere near as morally lofty as Jesus' command to do good to others before they've done so to you. This is not exactly a good example to try to prove that Jesus relied on the Deuterocanon, but there are a few better examples. Sirach is an example of Jewish wisdom literature, and it obviously tries to pattern itself after Proverbs, and we've already noted that Jesus got some of his teaching from Proverbs' wise sayings. Sirach 7:14 says not to pray with repetitions, which Jesus commands in Matthew 6:14-15. When Jesus commands us to lay up treasure in heaven, a nearly identical teaching is found in Sirach 29. When Jesus says, you will know them by their fruits, this is a remarkable parallel to Sirach 27, which says that fruit discloses the cultivation. I've been unable to find any similar wording in the Hebrew Bible. Comment below if you know of any. What about the New Testament writings outside of the Gospels? They also sometimes parallel something only found in the Deuterocanon. For instance, Hebrews 1:3 says that Jesus is, quote, the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, end quote. Wisdom 7:26, which was written before Jesus, is speaking of God's wisdom like Proverbs does, as if she were a separate divine being, embodying an attribute of God. This goes beyond personification and is called hypostasis. In another series, I'll explain how the Gospel of John leans on this idea as he speaks of Jesus as the Logos of God, but for right now, I want to focus on wisdom, which seems to be expounding on ideas found in Proverbs about Lady Wisdom, who was in the beginning with God and helped him with the creation. Like Hebrews 1:3, Wisdom 7:26 says that this wisdom, a hypostatic divine attribute of God, is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. The wording is remarkably similar to Hebrews 1:3 and is not found in the Hebrew Bible. Maybe one of the best proofs of a New Testament passage relying on a deuterocanonical book is in Revelation. If I had to pick a book off the top of my head with the highest percentage of allusions to other scriptures, it would be Revelation. So much of it relies on the apocalyptic prophets of the Hebrew Bible. So if a New Testament author was going to cite the Deuterocanon, I would look in Revelation first. Revelation 8:2 mentions the 7 angels that stand before God. This detail is never mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, but is definitely found in Tobit 12:15 and 1 Enoch chapter 1. Jude, as I explained in the next lesson, actually quotes 1 Enoch. Yes, technically 1 Enoch is not classified in the Deuterocanon. Most scholars call books like 1 Enoch pseudepigrapha, but that doesn't change the point. Jude cites it, and it appears to me that he cites it as authoritative scripture, even though you'll hear Protestants argue against this. But you can be the judge of that. Also, the Ethiopian church would probably laugh at this whole discussion, as they have included 1 Enoch in their canon from the earliest centuries of Christianity. Join me in the next lesson to see how many deuterocanonical works Jude actually references in his short book.